This video is brought to you by Squarespace. The year is 2023, and I'm still thinking about SLAPCHOP, or grisaille, or underpainting and glazing, whatever you want to call it. This method of speed painting was popularized last year by Rob the Honest Wargamer, and from what I can tell, still remains popular to this day. However, as great as SLAPCHOP is, I do think there's always room for improvement. I tried out a few tips and tricks in my original SLAPCHOP video that I made about a year ago, linked down in the description, but since then, I've learned things. 5 things, specifically, that are either interesting variants on SLAPCHOP or ways you can improve that basic SLAPCHOP process. So let's get started. Tip number 1, RAWCHOP. In the traditional SLAPCHOP method, we apply a black primer, a gray dry brush, a lighter white dry brush, and then apply our transparent paints of choice on top of that. That's SLAPCHOP, baby. And sure, this method is fast, but what if I told you there was an even faster method of achieving these same results? A method that anyone can do, no airbrush, no spray cans, no well-ventilated area required, and only requires 2 paints plus your transparent paints of choice, and will give you similar and potentially even better results? Welcome to RAWCHOP. The idea for this kind of painting originated with my recent move. I didn't have my airbrush set up yet, I hate using spray cans, and I just wanted to get some monsters primed and painted quickly for use in my D&D game. So I got a bit lazy, I got a bit experimental, and I decided to take my airbrush primer and just see what would happen if I brushed it on the miniature. I figured maybe it'll take a few coats, but I can probably get a solid prime out of this and just use my acrylics on top of it. Now, I don't typically recommend brush-on primers as they can obscure the detail on your miniatures, but I was a bit desperate in this case, so I decided to give it a try. And as soon as I did this, I noticed something interesting was starting to happen on my miniatures. The black airbrush primer was so thin that it almost looked like a contrast paint when I brushed it on the miniature. It sank into those recesses in a really satisfying way. And so instead of applying a few more thin coats to complete the prime job, I had the thought, what if I just dry brushed some white paint on top of this, using the gray plastic itself as the mid-tone for a SLAPCHOP. So I tried this out, and I have to say it not only worked surprisingly well, but for me, I found this was a lot faster than the traditional SLAPCHOP method. And in addition to this, I really liked how much of the crisp details were preserved because of the really thin primer that I used. The only issue that I can think of with this method is that perhaps the paint might not stick as well to the model because we didn't do a proper prime job. But number 1, I don't really think that's the case. And number 2, I think that Army Painter Speed Paint 2.0 could be the perfect counterbalance to this priming method, as whatever medium was used for the Speed Paint 2.0 paints has this habit of drying really hard into an almost hard coat. I think this was to help prevent reactivation, but that's just a theory. But so far, using Army Painter Speed Paints 2.0 on top of RAWCHOP seems to be working pretty well, and I haven't seen any sort of chipping or rubbing off of the paint so far. So that's RAWCHOP. Right now, I think it's still a little bit experimental, but try it out for yourself and let me know what you think. Tip number 2, use a higher quality white for your dry brushing. This tip comes from my friend Lila Mev over at the channel Lila Mev. Go subscribe to her if you haven't already. But basically, in one of her videos, she mentions that using a higher quality artist's acrylic can make all the difference in a SLAPCHOP process. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense that a higher quality paint would work better, but trust me, she was really right about this, and it makes a huge difference. Using a higher quality artist's acrylic for your SLAPCHOP instead of just a basic hobby white can be a good way to make those highlights really pop. And as a follow-up step, I often just like to highlight things manually using a artist's acrylic white, and I've really found it makes a huge difference in my SLAPCHOP process. Which leads me naturally to tip number 3, scrambling instead of dry brushing. Oh wait, no, sorry, I meant to say tip number 2.5, build a website. In fact, 10 out of 8 miniature painters agree that building a website is the best way to get better at SLAPCHOP. And what better way to do this than using the SLAPCHOP of the website building world, this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that I've been using for just a little bit over a decade now for all of my website needs. And quite simply, it's as easy to use as SLAPCHOP, maybe a little bit easier. You just pick from one of their expertly designed templates, add in any pages or extras that you might want, and then customize things to your heart's content using their incredibly intuitive drag and drop grid system. No coding or technical knowledge required. I've been using my current Squarespace website for about a year and a half now to host a gallery of my painted miniatures, all of my painting reference documents that you might find useful, as well as an online store where I can put up anything for sale that I might want. So if you need a website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial? And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. Tip number 3, scrambling instead of dry brushing. In my head, I was actually calling this technique feathering, but then I found out that feathering means something completely different. So I'm calling it scrambling. It's a really easy technique that I started using at first on my Star Wars Shatterpoint figures, when I was attempting to get a more rough, sketchy look to match the Clone Wars TV show painting style. But since then, it's become my go-to technique for highlighting, and that includes applying highlights for SLAPCHOP. The method goes like this. Instead of using a wide or round brush like you'd use for dry brushing, use a more typical brush like you'd use for painting. Then wipe off most of the paint like you would for a dry brush, but not quite as much as you would for a dry brush. And then you are going to just roughly highlight the figure with the side of your brush, like you might do for an edge highlight, but way less precise. Essentially, scrambling is the direct middle between dry brushing and edge highlighting. Less precise than edge highlighting, but more precise than a dry brush. It takes a small amount more time to do this than dry brushing, but the results are much more precise and you have a lot more control over where the highlights are placed. It's basically just a heavier, more controlled dry brush, but you're going to be learning brush control as you do this and practicing your painting skills, which is always a good thing. Of course, there's going to be cases where you still want to use a dry brush. Maybe you do some dry brushing and then some scrambling on top of that. In either case, it just gives you a lot more options. And whether you choose dry brushing or scrambling, this next tip is going to make both techniques a lot easier. Tip number 4, use a texture palette. I've heard a lot of different tips about dry brushing over the years. Use a little sponge to keep your dry brush a bit moist, or use fancy round makeup brushes. And to be quite honest, for my painting style, I often find that both of those don't make a huge difference, and I often prefer a flat brush to a round brush for dry brushing. But the one change that a lot of people recommend that I have actually started using and have found has made a huge difference in my dry brushing is to use a texture palette instead of a paper towel for wiping off the excess paint before dry brushing. I'm not really sure the technical reasons why this works, whether it retains some moisture on my brush or something. I just know that it works, and it's a really easy change to make for your dry brushing or scrambling. And if you don't own a texture palette or know what one is, I'm going to show you how to make one right now. Step 1, get yourself a palette. This can be anything from a piece of wood to a floor tile to an old plate. In this case, I'm using an old plate. Step number 2, glue a bunch of spare textured plastic to your palette. This can either be miniatures or terrain you don't think you're ever going to use, or you can go to the dollar store and buy some cheap plastic toys and rip them apart and use those. Honestly, it's whatever you have lying around that has a lot of texture to it and that you don't think you're going to use for something else. For me, I ended up using some Dungeons and Lasers parts that I still have lying around and haven't painted yet, but you could literally use anything with a little bit of texture to it. The more varied different textures that these pieces have, the better. Step 3, once the glue has dried, use a mixture of sand and gravel. Again, this is whatever you have. I got some gravel from outside and mixed it with some playground sand, and just dump a whole bunch of it onto your texture palette. Enough to just sort of barely cover all of the other stuff you already have on there. Once you have all the gravel and sand on your palette, cover it up with a thick coat of Mod Podge. In this case, I'm using that classic Blackmagic craft mix of 50% Mod Podge and 50% cheap black craft paint. The black craft paint is purely for aesthetic purposes to give us a solid black look on our palette. You could just use Mod Podge if you want to. And once the Mod Podge is on there, mix it around with the gravel and sand and try to cover up the whole surface of your palette, but making sure to leave some spaces where the plastic underneath shows through. The idea here is to create the largest mixture of different textures on the palette, so we want some more smooth surfaces and some really gritty surfaces as well. Once you've done this, let the whole thing dry for at least 24 hours and you've got yourself a texture palette. I find the sand and gravel really helps add some extra grit to things, and you can use this instead of a paper towel to wipe off the excess paint before dry brushing. The nice thing is that you can see exactly how much paint is left on your brush using this tool, so if you want to do a heavy or a light dry brush or do some scrambling, it's easy to have a lot more control using this tool. Apparently this also helps retain some moisture on your brush that would otherwise be absorbed by your paper towel, and so that's also a good reason to use a texture palette. But speaking of moisture, tip number 5, experiment with glazing instead of just using transparent paints for your SLAPCHOP. Okay, so this one might seem a little bit like we're venturing outside of the world of SLAPCHOP into a new method, but hear me out. If you find that you tend to get bored easily with the typical SLAPCHOP method, and you want to practice your painting skills, instead of making speed painting a mindless process, why not try glazing instead of transparent paints? For a brief summary of what glazing is, it is essentially the process of laying down transparent layers of paint on your miniature, but in a more controlled way. Using a combination of drying retarders to slow down the drying process of your paint, thinning mediums to thin your paint down into more of a transparent medium, or using a glaze medium which does both things for you in one. Now, I've already done a whole video on this. It was the second video on the channel, and I think it still has the most views of any video on this channel, so even though it's quite old, you could go check that out if you want a primer on glazing. But today, I'd like to show you an even easier method of glazing that I have just discovered by experimenting with Monument Hobby's Pro Acryl line of paints. Although you could probably do this with any other pigment-dense paint, Monument Hobbies has become my new go-to line of glazing paints because I've noticed that they have a slower drying time that I'm used to with acrylics, as well as having a higher pigment load than I'm used to with standard hobby acrylics. These two factors combined make them excellent for glazing without adding any other mediums to the paint. And if you watched to the end of my last marble video, you might already know what this technique is. In fact, when using Pro Acryl paints for glazing, I don't even bother thinning the paints down. Here's what I do. I first put my paint onto a dry palette and take a little bit on my brush. I then wet my brush with the paint still on it using a slightly damp paper towel, wiping off the paint as if you were going to do a dry brush, but a damp version of that. Using this small amount of paint, plus adding this small amount of moisture, I then add the glaze over top of any parts of the model where I want the color to be. I find that by doing this, it's really easy to move the pigments around on the model with my brush, adding the color to just the places where I want it to be. Once I'm happy with the result, I clean my brush, wipe off the excess moisture on a paper towel, and then I go in and remove the paint from anywhere where I want a stronger highlight. Once again, this works really well with Pro Acryl because the drying time is a little bit slower and you have that window to remove the color as much as you want. This takes a little bit more time than just slapping on some transparent paints, but the results can be much better, and you're practicing your brush control and glazing skills while you're at it, so it's not really a waste of time if one of your goals is to get better at painting. And that's it. Those are my top 5 tips for a better SLAPCHOP in 2023. But what did you think? What was your favorite tip? Do you have any SLAPCHOP tips for me that I didn't cover in this video that you think I should try? Leave all of that down in the comments, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can. As always, thank you so much to our wonderful, generous patrons. I quite literally couldn't sustain this channel without you, so I really appreciate your direct support. If you'd like to help fund more videos like this, see your name in the comments or join our wonderful, exclusive, inclusive Discord server, you can do so over at patreon.com/DanaHowell. But whether you're a patron or not, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.